The pylon came down in the second hour of the evaluation. Tessa Vorn heard it before she felt it, a low metallic groan from somewhere in the upper superstructure of the Grevath Station assessment module, the kind of sound that experienced engineers called a fatigue signature and inexperienced ones called nothing because they never heard it twice. She had 3 seconds of warning. She used 2 of them to move and 1 of them to brace. The collapse was partial. That was the only good news, and she catalogued it as such with the same flat clarity she used to catalog everything else. The right side support pylon had sheared at its base, coupling probably corrosion, probably long before anyone at the station had thought to look, and when it went, it took the overhead assessment grid with it. 40 meters of reinforced evaluation scaffolding dropped on the northeast quadrant of the chamber, where Tessa was not, where the exit corridor was. She was in the southwest corner. She had been measuring atmospheric particulate density with a calibration rod, which was the last task on the Tier 3 solo assessment checklist, which she had been completing methodically for 90 minutes. The rubble that caught her was secondary fall, smaller debris knocked loose by the main collapse. A pressurized conduit, fractured clean through, dropped across her right leg below the knee. The conduit itself was not heavy. The section of grid decking that came down on top of it was. She did not scream. There was no one to hear it, and it would have wasted air. The chamber's main lighting array had shorted in the collapse. Emergency phosphors along the baseboards were still active, throwing everything in pale amber at ankle height. She could see her immediate surroundings clearly enough to assess. She assessed. Her right leg was pinned under approximately 300 kilograms of decking. She could feel her foot. That was meaningful. It meant circulation was not fully occluded. The pain was significant but clean. No grinding. No bone movement when she pressed her palm against her shin above the conduit. She noted this. A fracture was possible. A clean crush was more probable. Either way, the leg was functional if she got it free. Her emergency beacon was on her left wrist. It was intact. A single button, large enough to activate with a fist, would transmit her coordinates and a distress flag to the surface station 60 meters above. She looked at it for approximately 4 seconds. Then she looked away. The evaluation clock was still running. She could see it on the chamber wall, the one display still powered by the backup cell, a bright white number counting upward from 0. 2 hours, 11 minutes, 43 seconds. She had 11 hours remaining on the assessment window. She began to work. Proctor Senior Urath had been managing Tier 3 evaluations at Grevath Station for 6 years, and in 6 years no candidate had triggered a seismic event. The station sat on a stable uplift. The stability assessments were current. The pylon had been rated for another 4 decades. He stood in the monitoring alcove above the collapsed module and stared at the readout that showed a structurally inert chamber, a severed camera feed, and one biometric signal that was alive, irregular, and not calling for help. "The abort beacon is functional," said Proctor Second Aravith, who was slate purple like all the Vorathi station staff, and who was reading the signal telemetry with an expression Urath recognized as the early phase of controlled alarm. "Candidate Vorn has not activated it." "I can see that. The chamber's structural integrity is compromised. We cannot open the access hatch without risk of secondary collapse." Aravith pulled up the architectural schematics on the secondary display. Engineering estimates 4 hours minimum before they can safely establish a rescue approach from the South Service Corridor. 4 hours? Minimum. Urath looked at the biometric feed. Heart rate elevated. Respiration elevated but regular. Core temperature nominal. The signal of a candidate in acute physical distress who was nonetheless breathing with evident deliberateness. He had processed 4 human candidates through Grevath Station. None of them had behaved like human candidates were described in the literature. The literature said humans were resilient, adaptable, products of a Class 16 biosphere with a pain threshold that registered as anomalous on standard medical scales. The literature had felt, to Urath, like mild exaggeration, something institutions wrote to manage expectations. He was beginning to revise that assessment. "Get me engineering," he said. "Tell them 3 hours." Tessa had been working the conduit for 40 minutes when she understood that leverage was the problem. The decking above the conduit was not attached to anything. The collapse had sheared its anchor points cleanly. It was dead weight. Dead weight could be moved if she could get under it with something rigid, but the only rigid things in reach were the calibration rod, which was 1 meter long and made of lightweight survey alloy, and a section of the broken pylon housing that had slid to within arm's reach of her right hand. The pylon housing section was better, heavier than the calibration rod, thicker at the base, with a natural fulcrum angle where it had sheared. She worked it into position by hand, lying on her back, using her left leg and both arms because her right leg was a fixed point she could not move without undoing the one good thing about her situation, which was that the decking's weight was currently distributed across the conduit and not directly onto bone. She established the lever. She tested the fulcrum angle. She calculated the force she could generate from her current position, flat on her back, working mostly with her left leg and shoulder, and found the calculation discouraging but not impossible. She pushed. The decking moved 11 millimeters. She felt it in the conduit pressure on her shin. She held the lever position for 30 seconds, which was as long as she could sustain the force, then eased off. 11 millimeters. She noted it. Then she repositioned and pushed again. By the 4th attempt, her left shoulder had developed a deep ache from the angle. By the 7th, the ache had moved into her lower back. She adjusted her position each time, distributing the load differently, working through the available angles the way she had been taught to work a technical climbing problem, not with more force but with better geometry. The calibration rod served as a shim, placed under the decking edge to hold the incremental gain after each push, so she did not lose ground between attempts. By the end of the first working hour, she had moved the decking 60 millimeters. It was not enough. She needed 90 to clear the conduit entirely, and then she needed the conduit itself to move, which was a separate problem. She took 3 measured breaths. She checked the air quality indicator on her suit sleeve. The chamber's atmospheric processors were still running on the backup cell, which meant she had a functioning air supply for some number of hours. She could not determine precisely, because the backup cell's charge indicator had been in the section of wall now buried under rubble. This was an uncertainty. She did not allow it to become a variable she acted on, because acting on it would mean stopping work, and stopping work would mean the question answered itself. She repositioned the lever and pushed again. At the 4-hour mark, Urath's engineering team had reached the service corridor junction. They had eyes on the chamber's south access panel. They still could not open it without destabilizing the upper debris field. Aravith had taken to watching the biometric feed the way Urath watched the schematics continuously without looking away. "Her heart rate has been in the elevated working range for 4 hours, she said. "No spikes, no arrhythmia patterns. She's pacing herself." "That's what the data suggests." "Yes." Aravith sounded as though she was still deciding whether to believe her own words. "The abort beacon has not been activated." Urath said nothing. He had stopped expecting it to be activated sometime around hour 2, which was also when he had stopped thinking about this as a standard rescue operation and started thinking about it as something else. He was not sure yet what to call the something else. The Vorathi did not have a common word for an entity that had been buried in a collapsed chamber for 4 hours and was still generating the biometric signature of a person solving a problem. The evaluation clock on his monitoring display read 6 hours, 22 minutes. Tessa cleared the conduit at hour 5 and 40 minutes. The final push had required everything she had in her left leg and both arms simultaneously, with the calibration rod jammed as a wedge at the maximum gain position, and the pylon section levered at an angle she had spent 20 minutes calculating and repositioning. The decking shifted. The conduit rolled. Her right leg came free. She lay still for 60 seconds. This was not weakness, it was inventory. Her right leg was functional. Pain was significant, the kind that sat in the deep tissue and made everything deliberate, but she could flex her ankle and feel the floor through her boot. She pressed along the shin with both thumbs in the pattern the Vorathi Station medical orientation had described for field fracture assessment. No crepitus, no abnormal mobility, bruising, probable crush injury to soft tissue, possible hairline to the fibula. She noted this and stood up. The standing took longer than she would have liked. Her left leg had been the working leg for nearly 6 hours, and it had opinions about the current request. She braced against the wall and straightened by increments, distributing weight carefully, finding the balance point between functional and compromised. It was not a comfortable point. She stood on it anyway. The exit corridor was buried. She had known this since minute 3. What she had spent the intervening hours deciding was not whether to reach the exit corridor, but which route to take through the debris field to reach the south access panel, which the station schematics memorized during the pre-evaluation briefing, because the pre-evaluation briefing had listed familiarity with emergency egress as a recommended preparation. Placed at 11 meters south-southwest through what was currently a field of collapsed grid sections and pressurized conduit wreckage. She picked up the calibration rod. It was the closest thing to a tool she had. She started moving. At the 6-hour mark, Vorathi's engineering team had breached the service corridor to the south access panel junction. They had established that the panel itself was functional. They were waiting on confirmation that the debris field on the chamber side had stabilized enough that opening it would not pull the remaining superstructure down. The confirmation was taking time. At the 7-hour mark, Vorathi said, "Her position signal has moved." Vorathi looked up from the schematics. "Moved how?" "She's no longer in the southwest quadrant. Vorathi checked the triangulation. Her voice flattened in a specific way Vorathi had learned to read as professional composure applied over something else. "She's 11 meters south-southwest of her original position. She is 6 meters from the south access panel." Vorathi stared at the biometric feed for a moment. Then he looked at his engineering team lead on the secondary channel. "Open the panel," he said. "Sir, we haven't confirmed debris stability on the—" "Open the panel." The panel opened inward. Tessa had been sitting against the chamber wall 2 meters back from it, resting, because resting was also a calculation. She had known the panel was there. She had known someone was on the other side of it, and she had known that spending her remaining reserves on covering the last 2 meters before they opened, it was less efficient than waiting. So she had sat down in the dark and waited. Light came through the opening. Vorathi station staff, 4 of them in emergency response suits, and behind them a 5th figure she recognized as a senior proctor from the evaluation briefing. She stood up. This also took longer than she would have liked, but she completed it without assistance. "Candidate Vorn," the proctor said. His voice had something in it she could not immediately classify, not relief exactly, something more like a recalibration happening in real time. "You did not activate the abort beacon." "No," she said. "You were pinned under structural debris for nearly 6 hours. 5 hours and 40 minutes, she said. "Then I moved to the access panel. Total chamber time was approximately 9 hours. She looked at the evaluation clock, still visible on the still-lit display behind the debris field. The assessment window was 11 hours. I had time. One of the staff members said something to another in Vorathi that Tessa did not speak. The proctor did not translate it. He was looking at her leg, which was bruised visibly through the torn fabric of her suit trousers, and at her left shoulder, which had stopped hurting somewhere around hour 7, and had therefore become a thing she would deal with when there was a medical facility available. "You have time," he said slowly, as though he was testing the phrase for structural integrity. The evaluation parameters didn't specify the abort beacon as a disqualifying non-use, she said. "I checked before I went in. The beacon is optional equipment." She met his eyes. I was still inside the window. He was quiet for a moment that had weight to it, the kind of silence that came not from having nothing to say, but from revising what had already been prepared. "Come with us," he said finally. She did. Through the panel into the service corridor, past the engineering team who had stopped working to watch her pass, past the secondary monitoring station, where another proctor was staring at a biometric display with an expression she had no word for in any language she knew, up 2 flights of emergency stairs, into the light. Behind her, the evaluation clock was still running. She had not triggered the abort signal. The window was not closed. In the part of her mind that ran calculations independent of everything else, she noted this, filed it under decisions that had been correct, and kept moving.